I'm going to start this off by doing an npm init. To do an npm install of Angular and Bootstrap, and I'll save this. It'll load pretty quickly. But again, not all that much to set this stuff up. Let me do a touch for index.html. And let's get started. So here's my package JSON. Let me go in here, and this is going to be HTML, head, body, h1, directives. Again, you could get a server running fairly easily if you install HTTP server. And now I could open up a browser and browse to this. Localhost 8080. Okay, so here's my page. Let's actually just bring in Bootstrap pretty easily. Again, we'll do a link, style sheet, and the href is going to be node modules, Bootstrap, dist, CSS, Bootstrap, CSS. And if we see our font change, we'll know that that worked. Let's put this inside of a container. And so what I want to do here is I also want to bring in Angular script source / node modules angular.js. Again, my sanity check is to always just put in some braces. And if this is an ng app, as an ng app directive, I should see the number 100. If I don't, I would see the braces because it's not treating this as a template. Okay. So once I have this set up, let's actually set up my application by doing script. And really easily, we could just say source / app.js. And let's say that we have an app, which is going to be app, which doesn't exist yet. And I go back here. Now I'm broken, right, because it doesn't know what this module is. And again, the error messages are pretty helpful, right? Doesn't know what this module app is because it doesn't exist. Let's go back and we'll end up creating our app.js. You know we have Angular, module, app. All right, nice and simple. Okay. So let's say that I have a controller that I've set up. I'm very happy with this controller that I've set up. And we could actually keep this on one line here, controller. And this is going to be called my silly control. Again, we could have it started off by breaking it. But let's actually set this up. And so we'll put on our index page in our container. I'm going to say a div ng controller equals my silly control. And within this silly control, let's say that we have a div class equals panel default. And we'll say div class equals panel body. And I want to just assume that I'm going to have something on my scope called foo that doesn't exist yet. Okay, so here's my panel. And let's actually even go in here and say div class equals panel, I think it's header, either header or heading. Header?
Yeah.
Nice. I'm a silly
Unless I'm wrong, that's not.
control. Sure. I get this wrong every time. I think I've got some memory issue or something. Okay, so we've got this thing. We're not displaying anything here, but we don't have any error messages. But we'll go to our app, and we'll do our standard scope. What value do you think we should give foo? 4, of course. Come on, what's the matter with you? So we do that, and this works. And I'm so happy with this controller. I mean, I'm psyched up about it. I go over here, I say, you know what, this is amazing that I have the ability to do this. I say it's so great that I actually want to put this, I want to display it a bunch of times on my page. Now, let's be very clear about something. We have the ability for reusability within our controllers. Factories give us reusability, right? We know that the main things that we get out of factories is that we can reuse code, and it also gives us state, right? That's the big benefit. You remember that for the next flashcard game or whatever that was, Dan, that you did before. So if we go over here and I say, hey, look, I really love this. I've got no reusability. I've none, okay? I could put in another controller, right? I mean, I could go over here and I could say div ng controller, my silly control. I could put in foo here. That's fine, but I don't have my whole panel, which I want. So I'd be forced to go in here and do this. And go over here. And now I've got this, right? That's great until I decide I want another one. And then I go back here. And do this again, right? And so on and so forth, right? Now, if I decided to make a change to this and I said, all right, well, this is great. I have these 3 things. You know, maybe I want to display foo up here. And again, assuming I want all these things to be identical, I'm chasing my tail at this point, right? I got to go through every time I make a change to one, I've got to make a change to all of them. There literally is no way to do this without using directives. What I really would like to do is to be able to do something like this. I would love to say, hey, look, my silly directive. My silly directive. Huh? I'd like to be able to do that. That's a little bit easier, right? Than having all that, right? To have a directive. Now, if you do that, what you'll notice is basically you don't see anything because browsers, when they get tags that they don't understand, they have no way to render them, okay? So they're there, but they just don't render. So what directives allow you to do is to basically create custom HTML elements and also attributes, okay? So as a starting point, I have this directive. Now, directives there's a little bit of a tricky thing here. Sure. He's always got to interrupt me.
Sorry.
No, I'm just joking. So, you know, there's a little trick here that's important. So we've actually seen, we can define, think about all the things we could do, right? We can create a module, We can configure the module. Okay. We could create controllers. We could create factories. What else? Come on. We can. Yeah, but what can we do with a module? What can we create with a module? Controllers, factories. Come on, I did it earlier today. Filters, there you go. That's what I'm talking about, man. The guy went to Brown. Terrific. So if I go over here and I say, I could go over here and I could say, directive, okay? The problem is that there's a little transformation, okay? And so what happens is that when you have the dash case in the HTML, okay, you actually have camel case when you're defining the directive, okay? So in other words, you notice that I defined mine by my dash silly directive. Here you have to say my silly directive, and you have to return something, okay? So we could define a filter, we could define a directive. Now what you end up doing when you return from a directive, you're returning what's called the directive configuration object, okay? Directive configuration object has a couple of different parts, but the most important part is going to be the template, which is going to be, here's the directive, what do I replace it with? What am I starting out with to replace it, okay? So basically, you could load a template into a directive, okay? We know that we can do template and we can do template URL. Let's start out with template. Okay, here's my template. And you can see it's showing up here 3 times. Nothing prevents me from going in here, putting HTML.
You make use of file, is it just template URL or?
Did you read ahead?
No, I'm just guessing.
You're right. You're 100% correct. So what this does is, again, the important part is right off the bat, we know that Angular is going to look at this, and Angular is going to say, can I find the directive? Is there a directive with this name? Does a directive exist? And again, the key thing, the first mistake you're going to make when you do this is that you're going to name it incorrectly, right? This will end up getting translated to, what is it called, dash case?
Snake.
Snake. No, it's not snake. Snake is an underscore underneath.
Kebab case.
What is it?
Kebab case.
Kebab case?
Yeah, with the dashes.
It should be called, if it's not, it should be called kebab case. But so this ends up getting translated to kebab case, okay? And so this, my silly directive, right? So a lot of times with directives, you won't get an error if in fact you name it incorrectly, just nothing will show up, okay? So that's sort of, we could call that a little bit of a silent error. So let's go over here and let's modify this. We don't actually want to put the template in directly in here. If we were to do this, we could say template URL, and let's create a template. We'll call it silly.html. And it's going to end up looking for this, and this is where it'll end up throwing an error, because it recognizes it as directive, and it says, hey, look, I can't do anything here. I'm trying to load this template. I can't find it, okay? So let's actually go into our folder, add silly.html, and we'll make that error go away, although nothing will end up showing up because nothing is in that template. Let's go back to our index page. Let's take all this stuff that's in here. We're going to take it. And if I didn't mess up my HTML, that looks about right. Let's move this back. Okay. Works exactly as advertised. Let's actually just go back here and clean up our index page. Okay? This would be enough right off the bat. Right off the bat to go into your, when we end up going to Juke, right off the bat, you could actually take a bunch of stuff that's in your sidebar and take it and stick it in a directive. Nothing more than separating things out, right? Instead of having this index.html file that's really long, things are a lot shorter here. Now, let's talk about a couple of different things that we could end up doing here. Right now, this controller that we have, which is fine, is not really adding all that much to the game over here. If we were to go and take this out, we could go back over here to our silly. And what happens if we take out our controller? We end up losing our value for foo, okay? But one of the things that our directive gives us the ability to do is that our directive gives us the ability to access the scope. It's going to give it to us a couple of different ways. We're only going to worry about one way for the moment, okay? So I'm going to go over here back to my directive in order to get that back. Here's my app, okay? I'm going to get rid of this controller. I don't need it right now. I'm not using it, okay? So there's a second parameter that you can end up passing in here, which is called the link function. Okay? The thing I want you to remember about the link function, now I can't stop thinking about Dan's game at this point. The thing that I want you to remember about the link function is that the parameters are not injected by name. There are three parameters that are going to end up getting passed here. Okay? The first parameter that's going to get passed here, you could name it whatever you want to name it, but the first parameter that's going to get passed here is the scope. Okay? So if you went over here in your link function, and you went over here and you said scope, and you said scope.foo equals bar, you'd end up getting the bar back, okay? So in other words, think about the fact that there is this scope that's available, okay, inside your directive. You have access to the scope from this link function, okay? There's two other parameters that you might end up using here. You could end up using the scope. You could use, there's another parameter which are going to be attributes, and there's another parameter which is going to be the element itself that your directive is in. I rarely end up having a need to use them, although the need is sometimes there with more complex directives, okay?
Is this scope the same thing as dollar scope?
Correct.
But you don't use dollar here.
You could call it dollar here, but if you think you're going to get the dollar scope by doing this, you're going to be disappointed. What don't you have in this link function? Thank you. Okay, Dan, you got it?
That was on one of the next slides, but people don't want to go for.
There you go. Okay. So you could name it scope. In fact, people do name this with a dollar sign just for consistency.
You can name it whatever. You can name this Apple if you want to.
You can name it Apple if you want. It doesn't matter. It is the scope. It is the dollar sign scope that we're used to. Okay?
Yeah. So when we were in the UI router, you could embed UI view tags. And I think there was a way for you to actually name those tags so you can embed multiple.
I've never done it, but I know you can do it, and I think Kevin sent out a video on.
Yeah. It's not. It didn't seem especially difficult. You just define multiple views and then you just name.
Yeah.
I was sort of curious about, the benefits of doing that versus doing something like this if you need to embed multiple.
I think they're two totally different things, right? When we think of the UI views, I think we're sort of thinking about pages.
Mm-hmm.
When we end up thinking about directives, we're thinking about reusable HTML.
Okay.
We're thinking about our own custom HTML. For instance, like in our case, we want to be able to do something like this. In our Juke application, we would love to be able to go over here and do something like song list. Songs, I'm getting ahead of myself. Okay? Because it's basically like our custom HTML elements. It's giving semantic meaning to our application through the HTML. Okay? They're custom elements. I think it's a little bit different than the views.
Having like a template that's your song list that you could then embed in a UI view wherever.
Well, then you have to remember to embed it in the UI view whenever you want to use it, as opposed to, you know, this is one step removed from that.
Yeah.
You don't have to remember what the template is. You just basically set the directive.
Yeah, and there's also ng template that
Oh, yeah.
that worked pretty well, but that's
I never used it.
that. I mean, that works easy. I mean, you just set the URL of your HTML snippet or whatever
Yeah.
you use, and you put it on where you want. But this seems like it will have more.
It's got functionality.
Yeah.
The template, I don't think does.
No.
Okay. Yeah, and I think there was actually in an earlier, and I should put these up. There's a, prior to doing Juke, there was a much more simplistic introduction to Angular with something called flashcards, which wasn't, you can look at it now. I think you'd sort of breeze through the workshop. I could open it up to you guys. But the point that I want to get at here is that there's actually another way to do this. You also have the ability to define a controller. And the controller also has a scope, but the controller, the same way that we end up using controllers in our states with our UI router, okay? Controllers have dependency injection, okay? Controllers have dependency injection, in which case, if I say scope.fizz equals buzz, and I go back to my template, I see both of these end up showing up. Which one of these do you think happens first?
The controller.
Hmm?
The controller.
And I've been doing Angular for a while. I have no clue. And I don't care. And there's usually a lot of questions. Well, when should I use link and when should I use controller? Look it up on Stack Overflow. I still don't know exactly what the correct answer is. I think the bottom line is use link. If you decide to, you could still get dependency injection with link by injecting whatever you want to up here. If you want to set up a separate controller, use controller if you want to. But you could read those explanations about which one of those to use. It hasn't bought me much, and I've read the explanations a number of times. So, John?
You just put like scope.fizz equals scope.foo in the controller now.
That's it. Yeah, this actually was my next step. So what I'm going to do is, so let's actually, I was doing it the other way. This will tell us which one is first. Well, I guess you would have lost that bet, which I think I would have lost too. Okay? So it looks like the controller is called second. You only need one of these. Okay?
Isn't the controller first because it gets overridden by bar?
Yeah. So controller first, link second. Okay? Again, you could read up on it. If you really sort of figure out exactly why you need both of these, please let me know. The explanation didn't mean all that much to me. Maybe there's some real complex directives that you're going to end up doing. I think sort of the bottom line, actually I do know a little bit more about this. If in fact there's going to be some maybe complex nesting of directives or something along those lines, then transclusion is something I think a little bit different. But if there's going to be some nesting of directives or some communication between directives, then I think you're probably going to want to use controller. Otherwise, end up using link is totally fine for anything that you want to do. You still can get the dependency injection, and the reason why you could get it is that if you have a factory, you can inject the factory right here.
Why would you do this instead of defining a controller in a separate file? And I mean, it just seems like
Because it'll get all these.
why would you use link ever? Is what I'm wondering.
Would you rather use controller?
I mean, I don't know. I'm just wondering what just because it. Yes.
Use it.
Okay.
I can't. I'm serious. I really can't give you that great an answer. I mean, literally, you could look at the question with Stack Overflow that says like, use link unless you want to use controller. If you did want to put your controller in a separate file, you could do it. I agree with you. In some ways, I think that's totally legitimate. But I tell you the truth. If you guys did an assignment and you did a directive and you had a link function where you were setting up functionality, I don't think I would see anything wrong with it. I think, by the way, Angular is not perfect. I think there could be rationale for this, or who knows? Dan, you have something you want to add?
So just one use case that I ended up using specifically link over controller is link is, you could probably do this in controller too, but link is very good for binding directives onto a specific element from the template. As you can see, it takes it as one of the functions in your standard link thing. So like if you're trying to do something that has like a hover or a click type functionality, that's good for defining in your link, though.
No, you're right. You're right. If you did want to access the element directly, he's right. Like, so in other words, I think sometimes you would end up using link. I mean, a lot of times, like jQuery don't play so nice with Angular, right? So I mean, if you did want to sort of access some jQuery functionality, you might end up doing that by looking at the element. But I think you're right. I think separating out is totally fine. I think maybe if your link function, starts looking like this, but then I have another problem, right? Then my other problem with that is that if it starts looking like that, then your controller's too fat to begin with. It should probably be in a factory, right? Because we want to keep our controllers thin anyway. So let's move on. I want you to see that because I know the questions are going to come up, and it's about, at this point, the best answer I could give you.
About the scope.
Mm-hmm.
Does that include all the scope of the parents?
We'll talk about that.
Okay.
We'll talk about that. It can. It depends. Usually you don't want it to, and we'll talk about why. Okay? It's a good question. So let's go over here, and let's actually just switch this back to this guy. Okay? But let's actually talk about something that we might want to do here. Maybe one of the things that we want to do is that we want to be able to pass into our directive some kind of status. I mean, let's sort of give you an example here, make it a little bit more clear. Let's say that I have panel danger. Okay? But I don't want all of them to be panel danger. I want someone to be able to use my silly directive, and I want them to be able to set whether or not it's dangerous or not, okay? So I want them to be able to do something like this. I want them to be able to use my directive on the index page here, and I want them to be able to say, hey, look, status equals good. It's a string. Status equals bad, okay? I want my directive to have some functionality. Now, right now, this is going to do absolutely nothing. If I didn't know that directives had something like isolated scope, I guess I could go over here and I could look at my attributes that are on this thing. By the way, I don't think I've ever done this, but if we did this, console.log attr, could go over here, and we could see here is our directive. Yeah, hold on, let me just see if it's finding any of this. Well, that's not helping me out that much. You want me to zoom in on
Just make the
console log?
Everything bigger.
Oh, okay. So, and there's a way to grab these attributes. I always remember this with, oh, you know what? I'm doing it wrong. I'm grabbing the element. It's C, S-E-A. That's how I remember it. So this is actually, good catch, Professor. So if I go over here, it's actually C. That's how I remember it. So now if I grab these attributes, right here I can end up getting, here are my attributes, and here's where I see my status of good and bad. I don't want to do that, okay? What I want to do is I want to basically say to my directive, hey, directive, you know what? You've got yourself a scope. And whoever is using you is going to pass into you a status, okay? Now, there's a couple of different ways that you could pass data into a directive. If you just want to pass the data and say, hey, look, this data is just a string value, that's what it's coming at, it's just a string value, name of the, things get passed to the scope to a directive through attributes. So if I want to say treat this as a string, I could put an @ symbol here. And to just prove that to you, once I go in here, I've got my scope, console.log, scope.status. Okay? 2 of the statuses should be set. 2 of them shouldn't be set. Good, bad, and undefined. Okay? So, the good, the bad, and the undefined is such a terrific film. So let's go over here, and now let's, so the way that you're going to pass data to directive, it would be odd to me not to have this is called an isolated scope. So your directive has its own scope. Okay? If you didn't, a first cut maybe is to say, look, I want to turn this thing into a directive, and you can do it just by copying it into a file, and everything will work. Okay? But then you might want to isolate it, okay, to basically pass things and have your directive do some of the work, and that's what we're going to do here. So we're going to put some logic in here, real simply, on our view. So this is our directive file itself, and so instead of putting panel danger here, let's use our ng class, and this takes a map, and we'll say, hey, look, you are panel success if, in fact, your status is equal to good. Furthermore, you're going to be panel danger if your status equals bad. Okay? And we've used this a couple of times before. Everyone, and you'll make a mistake with this at some point, I do too. You notice that we have to put why do we need the single quotes around panel success? Yeah, because the classes are defined kebab style, right? And so these have to be valid objects. So we have to actually surround the keys with quotes. We use double quotes too, it doesn't matter, okay? But once we end up doing that, we'll get nothing. Okay, so ng class, panel success, panel danger. Let's print out our status. Status, no, status wouldn't need quotes. Let's actually do this. Oh, it's not status with a capital. It's not capitalized, right? Could have been, but that wouldn't be a great idea.
Okay, you're good and you're bad are capitalized.
Good and bad. Okay, right. And I want to point out another thing here. Okay, so that works. Okay, I just want to point out something else. Let's just say, just for the sake of argument, okay, that I wanted to name this not status. I wanted to name it the status. Okay, nothing's going to break here. But I've lost my functionality. What I want to point out is that camel case here, kebab case here. You follow?
Wait, what's kebab case again?
Kebab case is how you pass in data to the directive. Kebab case is dashes. Kebab case is what CSS uses. Kebab case is what HTML likes to use. Okay? So here,
But you called it.
what the status. You're right. Okay, now I'm almost back in business. Did I call it the status? The status, but then I'm in a little bit of a circle here, and I have to change this to the status. All you have to remember to pass data into directives, you think, oh man, you're gonna have it's gonna be a good game of, what is the game called? Passcode or?
Speed Quest.
Speed Quest?
Speed Quest.
Speed Quest, okay. We'll do Speed Quest next week. And again, I think I messed something up, so it's gonna be, no, the status. Okay. Now, let's make things, let's just modify them a little bit. I said that you could pass things by string, okay? But let's say that within our, let's make things a little different here. I'm going to surround this whole thing. And I'm going to call it my control. Again, what happens here when I do this? Everything breaks because I haven't defined my control. Perfectly legitimate, by the way. Controller could wrap around, right? It's okay, Andrew. We don't have a problem with that, right? Okay. It's told, no, it really is something you see all the time, right? So you know, let's do this. We'll put this controller back, or not back, but we'll say controller. And this is going to be my control. We'll make that message go away. And we'll say we'll make that message go away. So it's still not finding it. Controller, yeah, I have a problem here. Level 2 deep. A little bit better. Obviously, you could define these in multiple files. But once I do that, that message will end up going away. Bless you. Okay? Now, just for the sake of argument, let's just say that in this controller, I have a scope. Okay? Within this controller, I've got a scope. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say that I've got a collection of statuses. Actually, didn't even plan on doing this, but this is actually a good exercise. Okay. I've got this collection of statuses. And let's just say, for the sake of argument, okay, I'm going to put these on the scope. Scope dot statuses. Is that how you spell statuses? Stati? I don't care. I'm doing it anyway. I don't want to spell statuses. Well, the hell with it. Okay, so I'm going to say stati equals stati, right? Perfectly legitimate, right? I could do that, aside from the spelling. Okay? And if I go back to my index page, I could go over here, and I could say stati, so I could see it. Okay? Now, for the sake of argument, what if I went over here? So I've got this value available here. What if I said, hey, look, I've got this stati, which is an array, right? What if I went over here, and it looks like stati, the first one is good, the second one is bad, right? What if I went over here, and I said, hey, look, this status is going to be stati 0. Okay? I've got a status. That should still be good. Don't look too good. Right? Let's see why. If we go back to our directive, again, we changed this. It's no longer status. We're calling it the status. Hold the phone. Look at this. What happened? Stat I1, it's treating stat I1, right, stat I0, as a string. It's doing exactly what we said it was going to do. We said, hey, look, if you use the @ symbol treats that as a string. Okay? We don't want to treat it as a string. We want it to basically use the value that we have on the scope for that value. So this is the difference between using the @ symbol, okay, or using the equal symbol. So we're going to go up here and we're going to say, hey, look, we're not passing this as a string, okay, but in fact, we want you to basically go in here and we want you to go and interpolate the value. Use the actual value. Look at the scope and look for that value. Pass it in, okay? In which case, this works, but this doesn't work. And if we want it to work, we could go back here and say, give this stat I1. And then maybe we'll give this stat I2.
That's by reference, though, right?
You know, it's by reference, but you know what? It's a string value, so I think it's not going to be by reference, I guess. Okay? Bottom line is that if you actually want to use the value here, okay, use the equal sign. Okay? Now, again, if you wanted to pass an object here, you could pass an object here, right? I mean, as an example, let's say, I'm gonna beat a little bit of not that this makes the most sense here, but let's just experiment with it a little bit. I'm gonna go over here and I'm gonna say, my silly directive, and I'm gonna go over here and I'm gonna say, stat I equals stat I. Passing it through to the directive. Right now, by the way, nothing's going to break here. It's going to ignore it. It doesn't really know what the hell to do with it. But if I went back to my directive code, I could say, hey, look, you know what? Also, I'm going to pass stat I, and I'm going to pass it through the attribute stat I. Okay? Passing stat I through the attribute stat I, in which case, if I did a console.log scope.stati, what do I feel like I have an extra thing here? So here's our, I'm sorry, yeah, I put another directive here, right? So here I've got this other directive on the top with stat I. I'm passing it through here just for kicks. Just for kicks, if you ask the question whether something is passed by reference.
Yeah, I think you can modify the parent scope depth, right?
You can modify the scope that's passed in. Right. Okay. So let's say I went in here and I've got this scope.stati. I could see that I could print it out, right? I got a lot of stuff printing out. Let's clear this up a little bit. Instead of printing out the status, let's just print out stat I. I'm going to have the stat I, and then I'm going to have 3 undefines. Okay. I just want to show you something here, just so you could tell that this thing is being passed by reference. I'm going to say scope.stati0 equal to bad. And let's say we might have some issue here. cannot stop. And the reason why we have an issue here is we're not always setting passing in the stati. So if we're going to do this, we should actually say if scope.stati. Again, this is a very contrived example, but what am I getting at here? You have the ability to pass data as a reference into the scope. If you're thinking about passing in data, what are you thinking of? The equal sign. If you're thinking about passing a string, you're thinking about the @ symbol. Okay? Let's go one step further with this. Okay? Let's say that what I'm actually going to do here, let's say that you want to, one of the things that you might want to do from a directive, and this wasn't in the handouts, but I think it's pretty important. One of the things that you might want to do from a directive is actually communicate back up. Okay? Maybe you want to call some method. What's an example of this? Well, maybe you have we're going to actually do this with Northwind. Maybe you have a directive that's going to act as a filter. Okay? Maybe you're reusing this filter. That's why you want to have a directive. You're going to basically create a filter, which is going to be able to go in. And I don't mean the Angular filter. I mean basically a drop-down list of maybe departments, drop-down list of titles, and you want to filter something below it, and you want to reuse that filter. Well, it would be great if you could go in and do something like, to get the kind of reusability, go in here and say Northwind filter. And it would automatically give you the filter, okay? Well, you can imagine when someone ends up changing something on the filter, you might want to know that something changed on the filter because maybe you're using that filter to filter a collection of results. And maybe you don't want to return 2,000 records to your repeater. So you want to go and make an AJAX call and just basically do your filtering on the server, right? Well, in that case, you want to know how to communicate back, okay? So let's just go over here. And what I'm going to do is we're going to start like this. I'm going to go over here. Let's get rid of this stuff. It's not terribly useful here. I just wanted to show you how you could pass something. But let's say that we wanted to do something like, let's modify this a little bit. Instead of actually just saying scoop, scope.foo, let's do I'm going to create a random value. R&D equals math.random. Let's create a random number between 1 and 50 times 50, 49, 0 and 49. And instead of just having bar here, I'm going to add to this my random. Okay? And what we want to do here is that when the user ends up clicking, again, very contrived example, but nevertheless, when the user ends up clicking on this directive, I want to get that random value. Now, that random value is buried in this directive, okay? But I want to be able to push it out, okay? So let's say, again, I haven't set it up yet, but let's see how we can end up setting it up. Controller. And I'm going to put a function here. I'm going to say scope, show random, equals function. And I want to pass some random value in here. And I want to console log it. Okay? The problem is, how do I have my directive call it? Well, three things that you end up passing through attributes in a directive. Strings with the @ symbol. Objects with the equal sign. Methods with the ampersand. Okay?
Wait, methods with the what?
Ampersand.
Oh, the and.
Yeah, I have a mental block with ampersand. I always think the ampersand is the @ symbol.
Yeah.
I think they should call it something else. But kebab case. I'm happy for the day. Okay, so let's go over here and let's modify this. So what I'm going to do here, okay, I'm going to say, hey, look, with this, just for this second one, I'm going to say foo equals, okay? Now on my scope, I've got this show random. And I want to pass its random value. I know this seems really, looking at this, you don't know what the hell is going on, but I just want to point out a couple of different things here. Show random is a method. We know that that's a method on my scope. Okay? We know that that's a method on my scope. What I'm saying to the, what I'm actually saying to my directive, I'm going to pass you a method. Okay? I want you to call that method. Okay? And I want you to fill in a value for random. Okay? Now, again, I didn't write the directives. This might seem a little bit weird, but if you want to do this, the first thing that we could do here is let's go to our app and let's specify that we're passing this thing called foo. When we think of passing function calls, we think of the end symbol, okay? And we could look at this and say, let's not call it foo. We called this foo. That's bad. Okay. Let's call it, let's also, what do you want to call it?
North.
North. Let's call it north.
No, north.
North.
But the best reviews.
Oh. I like it. Okay. I can dig it. I can dig it. So let's go back here and we'll north. Yeah, I never read anything. So we have this north, okay? And now what we're going to do here is that within our directive, just so you could see it, right, one step at a time, console.log scope.north, okay? And this should say undefined, undefined. Here's this being called. All right, well, not quite what I was looking for. Nevertheless, let's see what happens here. Okay? Here's my guess what I think happens. I think when you put this here and you say I'm expecting a function, I think Angular will go and create a function for you that will wrap around that function that you may have or may have not passed in. Okay? Now, we only passed it into this second item, but what we're going to do here is now we're going to use our, we're going to go back to our template, and there's nothing that prevents us in our template by doing an ng click equals some function. Give me another one of these. North quux. QUX. We're going to call this method quux. Okay? One step at a time. It doesn't exist. We know something about Angular. Angular doesn't really care. It just basically, if it has this method, it'll call it. But it's not really going to do anything here. But if we go back and we go to our directive and we go to our link function and we say scope.quux equals some function. And let's do console.log hello, just so we can see it. And let's get rid of this console.log here. And what should happen is no matter which one of these we click on, it's going to say hello. Now, what we really wanted to do, is we want to say, hey, look, when quux is called, we want to actually say scope north. We want to pass in our random number, okay? Now, one would think you could just do that, but you can't. Wish you could, but you can't. Try it. Okay. In fact, we tried it and we get an error message. This is the only one that has that function, and it gives us a message. Let's see if the message is at all meaningful. Cannot use in to search for show random in 25. Not that useful. Okay. So the way that you end up calling this is that this is set up so that this is expecting this value for random. The way that you have to pass it is through an object, random, RND. Okay? It'll call Quux, whatever that is, excuse me, it'll call North, and it'll go in and it'll substitute inside random for that random parameter this random value, in which case again, nothing here because we didn't set it up. Here, we get back 49. Nothing. Nothing. Okay? Just for kicks, just so you could see this, and then we're going to look at the PDF presentation, which will make a lot more sense after seeing this, is that if we ended up going here, and I go to my index, and I'm going to say North, I'm going to say show random, but instead of just showing random, I'm going to say show random times 100. Okay? And I'm just going to go back to my controller up here, down here, and put in, I'll forget our semicolons, times 100, and I'm going to say R times 100. Okay? So you have the ability to pass whatever function that you want there. You just have to make sure that from within your directive, you name those parameters that get sent. So here, this is going to be 1400, and this is going to be 32. Okay? That's about the extent of what you really need to know about directives. Again, this idea of the link versus the controller, you could, read about that online, and again, maybe come to a better understanding of it than I have. But the bottom line is that when you pass things to a directive, you pass them through the attributes. The attributes are kebab case, okay? You have the ability of passing 3 different things, right? Strings, actual values with the equal sign, and methods. When you call those methods, just make sure that you call them with an object that names the parameters. Now let's actually just look at this, go through these slides really quick.
So the only way to pass a value from parent scope to a directive is basically through that mechanism.
Well, to go from the parent...
There's no automatic inheritance or anything.
There is. If you don't set up an isolated scope, okay, the directive will have whatever was available on the parent scope. But it just isn't, usually when you're building these things, you're building them to isolate them, okay? You don't want to give the directive anything more than it needs to have. Let's say you have 50 things on the parent scope. Why give it to the directive? Why does it need 50 things if it only needs to look at a counter for the number of songs, right? You want to basically be able to isolate these things. You want to be able to basically, someone looks at your directive, they don't want to guess what they need to pass in there, okay? If they look at the directive and they see it has isolated scope, they go, oh, all right, I know what I got to pass in here. So it contains things, okay? It's basically saying to the directive, hey, look, we're going to pass things to you on a need-to-know basis, right? And that's how, you know, basically you're turning your HTML into these components, okay? So let's pop this up real fast, these slides. So when we end up thinking about directives, right, we're looking at this HTML enhanced for web apps, right, for our own attributes, right? It's your HTML, do what you want with it, okay? So here's a directive. We've got a function, okay? And here are some things that I didn't mention. You have to return an object for a directive. This is your directive definition, okay? We've done all of our, by default, okay, you can end up putting, we've been doing our directives as elements, okay? You could also specify that you want them to be attributes or comments as well. Comments nobody ever uses. If you want them to be attributes instead of elements, you could put an A here. If you want them to be either, you could put an E and an A. So what I mean by that, well, you could look at it with an example. So I mean, in other words, if we went back here.
Eric, is there like one thing that you see more in the field than the other?
I always end up using elements, but then again, if you have multiple, if you want to put the directive, there's multiple directives that you want to put on something, that could end up being problematic. So, I mean, what I'm getting at here is that there's also the idea of doing this. What I just did. So let's take this guy here. Let's put him up here. And maybe doing a p tag with this inside of it. There's another thing you can do with directives, although we're not really sort of doing it here in the workshop. Let's just see what that does. Let's just go back here. Did it do anything? Let's find out. Isolate it. Let's just see what that did. So I think by default, let's just double check that. By default, this will work as either an attribute or as a directive. If you just wanted it to work as an element, and I go back here, and I say this is only going to work as an element, I can do that by putting on this restrict, and say it's only going to work as an element, in which case this gets ignored. If I wanted to work as both an element and as an attribute, which it sort of feels like that's what the default is, this will work. It'll end up working either way. Let me uncomment this. I'll actually put this repo up as well. You know, again, it just might be the way that you want people to use your directive. I don't know. I would sort of, as a default, I feel better about using it as an element than an attribute. So this is part of this definition here. So that's something that we didn't look at. We've looked at the template, right? The fact that this will end up getting substituted. And again, if we end up using this hello there, it's restricted as an element, we're going to get an H1 with hello there. So you have the ability to even use a, you know, in this case, you could end up doing an ng repeat over a directive, which is perfectly legitimate to do. And even in fact, we've been using directives all this time, but they've just been built-in directives. So here, in our case, this is something similar to what we did. We have this controller that's wrapping around this repeating of this directive. Again, we can end up looking at attribute directives. Here you want to, right? A is for attribute, E is for element. We've looked at our link function in detail, C, right? Scope, element, and attributes. And we've looked at the idea that we could have an isolate scope. So this slide is actually incorrect. If we had a song directive, one thing we might pass into it is a song to display the song or that sort of thing. And if we did that, then if this was the template, then we could end up accessing the song. Pretty similar to some of the things we did, but if you have an object, you could pass it. If you want to pass an object to a directive, what do you think of?
Equals.
There you go. Can you use symbols in that game, Fashion Quest? Quest?
You mean Speed Quest?
Speed Quest. Can you do that, like an equal sign?
Yeah, no one got that joke. Yeah, in Fashion Quiz, I make the rules.
So that's really going to do it for this. I'm going to open up the workshop. Let me end this. Well,